Somewhere in the last conversation you had with her, she told you exactly how she felt, and you never saw it. It wasn't hidden on purpose. It was right there, in the way she stood, in the pace of her voice, in something as small as where her hand went when she laughed. You were looking right at it, and you still missed it. Here's why. Most men are trained by movies, by friends, by dating advice to wait for something loud, a wink, a lingering touch, an obvious green light. So when a woman shows interest quietly, which is how it almost always happens, the signal passes right through you. Not because you weren't paying attention, because you were watching for the wrong thing. Think back to a conversation that once seemed ordinary, one where you walked away without realizing what had actually just happened. That's the question this video answers. Somewhere in your recent memory, there's a moment you've already lived through and misread. By the end, you'll be able to go back to that memory and see it differently, not through guesswork, but through the real quiet signals she was already giving you. Most men aren't bad at reading women. They're just reading the wrong chapter. For years, you've probably been told to watch for the big moment, the wink, the lingering hand, the obvious flirt. And when that moment never comes, it's easy to assume nothing is happening at all. But that's not how comfort and interest actually show up in real life. They show up small. They show up quiet. They show up in ways that don't look like anything special, which is exactly why they get missed. Here's what's really going on underneath. When a woman feels safe and interested around someone, her nervous system responds before her conscious mind even catches up. That means the earliest, most honest signals aren't things she chooses to do. They're things her body does automatically, long before she'd ever say a word about how she feels. Psychologists sometimes call this involuntary behavior, which simply means it isn't planned or performed. It just happens. Of course, this doesn't mean every quiet gesture is loaded with meaning. Context always matters here. A woman can lean forward because the music is loud, not because she's drawn to you. She can hold eye contact a beat longer because she's simply listening closely, not because something deeper is happening. One instance on its own tells you very little, but here's what changes everything. When several of these small involuntary signals start showing up together in the same conversation, they stop being random. They start forming a pattern. And pattern is the thing most men have never been taught to look for. You might be thinking, isn't this all just overthinking body language? Fair question. But you're not being asked to analyze every twitch and glance. You're being asked to notice a handful of specific, repeatable signals that together tell you something words rarely will. That is the part almost nobody explains properly. This is also where most men go wrong in the opposite direction. They see one small gesture, decide it means everything, and build an entire story around it by the end of the night. Then, when the story doesn't hold up, they conclude the whole idea of reading signals is nonsense. It isn't nonsense. It's just incomplete when you only look at one piece of it. There's also a quieter mistake underneath that one. Some men see nothing at all, not because nothing is there, but because they've never been shown what to look for. Once you know what the real signals look like, you stop needing the obvious ones. You start noticing what was always quietly present. The first real signal isn't something she does toward you. It's something her body does without asking her permission. There's a signal so subtle she'll deny it if you point it out because she genuinely doesn't know she's doing it. It's called mirroring, and it's one of the oldest, most reliable signals in human connection. When two people feel at ease with each other, their bodies begin to sync without either of them deciding to. Posture starts to match. Tone of voice starts to level out. Even the pace of small movements, reaching for a drink, shifting in a seat, starts to line up between them. Researchers who study rapport call this behavioral synchrony, which really just means two nervous systems settling into the same rhythm because they feel safe together. Here's what that looks like in an actual conversation. You lean forward slightly to make a point, and a few seconds later, without thinking about it, she leans forward too. You pick up your drink, and moments later, she reaches for hers, matching your pace almost exactly. Her shoulders angle the same direction as yours. None of this is performed, none of it is calculated. That's what makes it so telling. It can't be faked on the spot because it isn't coming from a conscious decision. It's coming from comfort. Of course, context always matters here. People mirror each other in all kinds of low-stakes situations. Old friends do it, co-workers do it, even strangers waiting for the same bus fall into rhythm sometimes. One instance of mirroring doesn't mean much on its own. You might be thinking, couldn't this just be a coincidence or a habit she has with everyone? Sometimes, yes, but here's the detail that separates habit from signal, consistency, and direction. If she's mirroring you specifically, repeatedly throughout the conversation, and it shifts when you shift, that's not a coincidence. That's her nervous system responding to you. The common mistake here is pointing it out, saying something like, "You're copying me." The moment you notice it, almost always breaks the very thing that made it meaningful, because now it's conscious instead of automatic. The value of this signal is in noticing it quietly, not announcing it. That is the moment most men miss without realizing it. There's another layer to this that most explanations skip over entirely. Mirroring doesn't just appear and stay constant, it tends to build. Early in a conversation, it might show up faintly, a slight lean, a small adjustment in tone. As comfort grows, it becomes more consistent and more noticeable, almost like the conversation itself is finding its rhythm. Watching that build over the course of 10 or 15 minutes tells you far more than any single frozen moment ever could. This is also why rushing a conversation works against you. If you fill every silence out of nervousness, you never give her nervous system time to settle into sync with yours. Slow down, and you'll start noticing mirroring you would have otherwise talked right past. But mirroring only tells you what her body is doing. The next signal tells you where her attention actually is. It's not the eye contact you think it is. It's not even about how long it lasts. Most men are taught to look for a stare, sustained, unbroken eye contact held across the room, and when that doesn't happen, they assume there's no interest at all. But that's a misunderstanding of how attention actually works. Eye contact that means something isn't usually about duration, it's about return. Here's the distinction. A single glance means almost nothing on its own. People look toward movement, toward sound, toward anything new in a room, purely out of instinct. That's just how human attention functions. It's drawn to novelty. But a returned glance is different. That's when someone looks away and then a few seconds later looks back toward the exact same spot without an obvious reason to. That return is not automatic in the same way the first glance was. It takes a small, quiet act of attention to come back to something on purpose. Remember what I told you at the start, that somewhere in a conversation you'd already had, she told you exactly how she felt and you missed it. This is often where that moment lives, not in one long stare across a crowded room, but in a quick look away, followed by a glance back toward you a few moments later, especially while you were talking to someone else or looking elsewhere yourself. Of course, context matters here too. In a work meeting, in a group setting, eyes move around the room constantly for entirely practical reasons. That's simply how attention gets distributed in a group. The signal isn't the movement itself, it's the pattern of where attention keeps returning to, especially when there's no practical reason for it to. You might be thinking, isn't it possible she's just naturally observant or checking who else is around? Sometimes, yes, and that's exactly why one instance proves nothing. But when her eyes keep finding their way back to you specifically, more than to anyone else in the room, across multiple moments in the same evening, that's not observation. That's attention with a direction. The common mistake here is treating eye contact as a single event instead of a pattern across time. A man who's waiting for one long, dramatic look will walk right past 5 quieter returns that mean far more. That is the signal that hides in plain sight. There's one more layer worth mentioning before moving on, because it trips people up constantly. Sometimes the return isn't a look at all, it's a brief glance followed by a small smile, almost involuntary, as if she caught herself doing it. That combination, the glance and the flicker of a smile right after, tends to matter more than either one alone. It suggests she's aware of the moment, even if only for half a second, which is very different from a blank, reflexive glance toward noise or motion. It also helps to notice what happens when you catch her eyes returning. Does she hold it for a beat before looking away, or snap away instantly like she's been caught? A brief hold tends to signal ease rather than discomfort. A sharp, immediate break can mean the opposite. Where her eyes go tells you about attention. Where her body goes tells you about comfort. And that one's even easier to miss. Watch what she does with the space between you, not once, but over the course of the conversation. Proximity is one of the oldest signals humans have, and it's also one of the most involuntary. When someone feels genuinely at ease around another person, their sense of personal space tends to shrink without them consciously deciding it should. Psychologists sometimes call this proximity seeking, the unconscious tendency to reduce physical distance towards someone we find emotionally significant. It's not a decision, it's closer to a reflex. Here's what that looks like in a real setting. Maybe you're standing at a gathering and there's a comfortable amount of space between you at first. As the conversation continues, notice whether that space quietly closes, not through one dramatic step, but through a series of small shifts, a half turn of the shoulders, a slight lean during a story, standing a little closer after returning from getting a drink than she was standing before she left. Positioning matters just as much as distance. Notice whether her shoulders and feet angle toward you or away from you, especially in a group setting where she has other directions she could easily be facing. A body angled toward you, even in a crowd, is a quieter version of the same signal, attention and comfort, expressed through orientation rather than words. There's also a smaller, easy to miss version of this signal, removing a barrier, a bag pulled off a chair between you, arms that started crossed slowly uncrossing, a jacket set aside instead of held in front of her body. None of these are dramatic, but each one removes a small piece of distance that was there a few minutes earlier, and that direction of change matters more than any single position on its own. Now, you might be thinking, couldn't some people just naturally stand close to everyone, regardless of interest? Of course. Some people are simply close talkers by nature, raised in cultures or families where personal space works differently. This does not mean every instance of closeness signals attraction, but when combined with what you already know about mirroring and eye contact, the pattern becomes far clearer than any one signal alone. The common mistake here is focusing only on distance and ignoring direction. A man might notice she's standing close and assume that's the whole story while missing the more telling detail, whether that closeness is new or whether it's always been there regardless of who she's talking to. There's also a detail worth pausing on because it's easy to overlook. Watch what happens when the two of you are briefly interrupted, someone else joins, or you're both pulled aside. When you come back together, does the space return to where it was, or does it stay closer than it started? That reset or lack of one often reveals more than the original closeness ever did. It's also worth remembering that proximity signals rarely appear in isolation. They tend to show up alongside the two signals already covered. A slight lean that mirrors yours, paired with a glance that lingers a moment longer than usual. When these things start layering on top of each other within the same few minutes, that's no longer a collection of coincidences. That's a pattern forming in real time, right in front of you. None of these signals mean much on their own. What matters is the one most men stop watching for entirely, because it doesn't look like a signal at all. Here's the signal that beats all the others combined, and it's the one you were taught to ignore because it doesn't feel exciting. Everything covered so far has been about the body, posture, glances, distance, all of it real, all of it useful. but there's a signal that sits above all of them in reliability, and it has nothing to do with body language at all. It's conversational investment, the effort a woman puts into keeping a conversation alive rather than simply allowing it to happen to her. This matters because of a simple truth about human behavior. Passive things are easy. Standing near someone, holding eye contact for a beat, even mirroring. None of these require much conscious effort, but asking a follow-up question does. Remembering a small detail you mentioned 20 minutes earlier does. Voluntarily sharing something personal about her own life unprompted does. These things take energy, and people generally don't spend energy on conversations they want to end. Think about what this actually looks like. You mentioned, almost in passing, that you went hiking last weekend. 10 minutes later, in the middle of a completely different topic, she circles back. Wait, where did you say you went hiking again? That's not politeness. Polite people nod and move on. That's someone whose brain filed away a detail because it mattered enough to hold on to. Or consider this. You ask her something ordinary, and instead of a short answer, she offers something slightly more than what was asked. A small story, a related memory, a detail about her life that wasn't required to answer the question. That voluntary extra piece is a form of investment. She's not just responding, she's choosing to keep building something with you. Researchers describe this as reciprocal self-disclosure, the back and forth exchange of personal information that deepens as trust builds between two people. In plain terms, the more she shares without being pushed to, the more invested she's becoming in the conversation itself. Now you might be thinking, couldn't she just be a naturally talkative person, someone who shares easily with everyone? Sometimes yes, and that's a fair thing to consider. But here's the detail that separates a naturally chatty person from someone genuinely invested in you specifically. Whether the follow-up questions and shared details are aimed at you, tracking what you've said, building on your specific story rather than simply talking about herself in general. One is a personality trait. The other is a conversation actively being built between two people in real time. This is exactly why men undervalue this signal so consistently. It doesn't feel romantic. There's no charged eye contact, no dramatic closeness, nothing that feels like a movie moment. It feels like a normal conversation, which is precisely why it gets dismissed. But normal conversation, sustained and deepened over time, willingly, is one of the strongest forms of interest there is. It simply doesn't announce itself the way people expect interest to announce itself. Go back now to that moment from the start of this video, the conversation that once seemed ordinary, the one you walked away from without realizing what had actually happened. There's a strong chance this was it, not a dramatic gesture, not an obvious sign, just her, asking one more question than she needed to, remembering something you mentioned once, staying in a conversation she could have easily let end. That is the signal most men walk right past without ever knowing it was there. The common mistake here is the most costly one in this entire video, mistaking a quiet, invested conversation for a boring one and cutting it short simply because it didn't feel intense enough to matter. There's one more piece worth adding because it's easy to overlook once you've heard the main idea. Investment doesn't only show up in what she says, it shows up in what she asks about you. Genuine curiosity about your life, your opinions, how you spend your time tends to be more telling than compliments ever are. Compliments cost nothing. Curiosity costs attention. This is also the piece that ties everything together. A woman leaning slightly toward you while asking a genuine follow-up question, her eyes returning to yours, the space between you having quietly closed, that isn't four separate observations anymore. That's one coherent picture built from small, honest, and voluntary pieces, all pointing the same direction at once. This is what you were missing in that conversation from the start of this video. Not one dramatic sign, a quiet cluster of small, honest ones, all pointing the same way. None of these signals are magic, and none require you to overanalyze every glance or step someone takes toward you. What they require is simpler, noticing the small, honest things a body does before a person consciously decides how she feels. That's the idea underneath everything covered today. Comfort rarely announces itself loudly. It builds quietly, mirrored posture, a returning glance, closed distance, one extra question asked because she wanted the answer. You don't need to catch every single one. You just need to know they exist. Think back to your last real conversation with a woman you were interested in. Which of these 5 signals did she give you that you didn't notice at the time? Tell me which one below. If this changed how you see a memory you already have, there's more here for you. But there's one signal that can seem to contradict everything you just learned. And understanding why it's actually the most honest one of all is next.